To kick things off, I'd like to apologize in advance. I'm not much of a writer, besides occasionally whipping up the odd shitpost or throwing out heated paragraphs in YouTube comment sections. Honestly, I don't really care about wicked detailing or anything like that. I just wanted to share my experiences in a place where I feel that people will care to read them and find enjoyment in the horror of it, as sick as that may sound. Well, at least it's better than it being brushed off. I feel a little bit less afraid, knowing that there's others who can understand a fraction of the terror I endured through my retelling of my own story. Do you know what I mean? I'm a 20-year-old guy in my second year of college. Sadly, I don't have much else to say about myself or my achievements in life so far. But nobody comes to this sub to read about that stuff anyway, right? I'm fortunate enough to have my own one-room apartment that my parents helped pay for. It's located relatively close to my campus and it's in a fairly decent neighborhood. But after last night, I'm kind of considering moving back in with my mum and dad. Not that it would serve to change much. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I can't exactly remember, I began to go through this ordeal, terrifying enough to cause me major setbacks in reaching my developmental milestones, as more than one counselor described. The event, as one such counselor would refer to it, would happen completely at random, sometimes twice a week or for months on end. And other times, it might come about once in an entire year, if I happen to be so lucky. There was one constant though. It would always occur during the dead of night, between midnight and 3 in the morning. For whatever reason, this incident, it would only ever play out when everyone else in my house was sound asleep. It was always the same thing. I would be laying in bed, in my room, sometimes asleep, sometimes not quite. And then, out of nowhere, I would hear it. The heavy footsteps of wet, bare feet stomping across the hardwood floor, originating from somewhere downstairs. Whoever it was, they didn't seem to want to be subtle or sneaky. Instead, they would always sprint all the way up the stairs at top speed, then down the hallway, before stopping directly in front of my door. Whoever it was, they were fast as hell, and I hardly ever had any chance to scream before they had reached the outside of my bedroom door. Now, my door has always been closed, so back then, I've never had a clear view of whoever was lurking outside. But strangely, and thankfully, they never really tried to actually enter my room. There was no lock on the door either, so whoever was out there, they were content in just standing there until they decided to go away. Though I never actually heard the leaving part in all my years of suffering through this. there were no footsteps trailing away. The person in question, they just didn't happen to be there when morning came. On rare occasions, they would knock on the door. Other times, they would jiggle the doorknob. But otherwise, they never really spoke to me. It was absolutely mortifying when it happened the very first time, and all I could do was cower beneath my sheets and sob, too afraid to even call out for my parents, in fear that some escaped convict or serial killer was waiting for me to make my presence known before they made a move. After that first harrowing experience, I would of course let my parents know what happened, and judging by how shaken up I was, they believed me wholeheartedly, without many questions at all. At first, they blamed each other, throwing out accusations of cruel jokes to try and scare me. But after it happened a few more times within that very same year, they began to grow just as terrified as I was, even though they had never been awake to hear it. It was the same ordeal every time it happened. That sound of sticky, wet skin against the hardwood, making a dash for my bedroom, sprinting up the stairs and towards the door with the speed and desperation of someone trying to escape a raging fire. Obviously, because of this, I didn't get to sleep at night, and I would often arrive at school in a sleep-deprived daze, hardly getting any of my work finished. My nights were spent laying awake for hours beneath the covers, my chest tight in anticipation of hearing that awful person rushing towards what should have been my safe haven as a kid. Most nights were usually silent, but the few where this intruder chose to torment me were enough to keep the cycle of sleeplessness alive. Eventually, my parents would remedy this by allowing me to sleep in their room, where I felt much safer between them. Two fronts of the sturdiest defense a child could know, lying on either side of me. This arrangement, it had me sleeping soundly once again, for about a year, without any incident. I was finally getting some decent rest under the direct protection of my parents, even if I had to suffer through my dad flattening me as he rolled around in his sleep. Even my grades and my health, they started to bounce back to where they were before all this started. The fear had finally begun to gradually seep out of my nights, as I had believed my parents were the ultimate defense against my tormentor. Until it happened again. I was sandwiched between my mum and dad, as usual, both of whom were sound asleep. I was finally drifting off when I heard that all too familiar sound of hurried pounding up the stairs. My heart was caught in my throat, and for a few seconds, I almost forgot how to breathe. Whoever it was had come back after a year of nothing. I was utterly paralyzed with fear all over again. Thankfully, this time, after reaching the top of the staircase, their destination, it remained the same as always. The footsteps were growing distant rather than approaching me, as I had been oh so used to, moving towards the bedroom that I had not occupied for some time now. I remember feeling awfully sick when I heard my bedroom door creak open down the hall. They had actually ventured inside. I can't remember if I left the door slightly ajar, since I had not slept in there for months, or if whoever it was simply decided that it was time to enter that night. But that was the first and the last time that it happened. I thanked my lucky stars that I was down the hall in the safe embrace of my parents. For whatever reason, this stranger had broken his or her code of conduct that night, and I still shudder to think of what may have happened if I had still been sleeping within my old room. Of course, by the time I had shaken my folks awake, everything was silent once more. The whole ordeal lasting no more than 30 seconds. They even got up to check my room, but, of course, nothing was lurking within. We tried getting help from the police, setting up security cameras, which of course showed nothing. At one point, they even resorted to hauling me off to a shrink, just in case this was all in my head. But nothing seemed to work. It still happened from time to time. It never really got any less scary, especially since I was getting too old to stay in my parents' room forever. When I was eventually forced back into my old room, I made sure that my door was locked. Yeah, I finally convinced my dad to put a lock on there. Even when I grew into my preteens, every time it happened, I still trembled beneath my covers, fearing that, at some point, whoever it was that was so eager to get into my room might eventually bust in and hurt me. I did try shouting at the stranger a few times as I got older and bolder over the years, demanding them to state what they wanted from me and why they kept this up for so long. But never, not once, did I get an answer. What I was never bold enough to do was open my door and check things out, no matter how curious I was, no matter how badly I had to use the bathroom or get a cup of water. I sat my ass in that bed until I heard my parents wake up and perform their daily morning routine downstairs before I was convinced I was safe enough to exit. The bastard was sneaky though. Sometimes I left the hall light on so I could see the shadows of their feet through the thin crack between the bottom of my door and the floor. They would sometimes stand there for hours, even stepping away for a few minutes before returning, as if to try to trick me. The worst part of this whole thing was that it didn't seem to be exclusive to my house or my room, as I had originally thought. Whoever was doing this was after me specifically. There were times it had happened during sleepovers at friends' houses, who I insisted keep the door shut at night. It would happen during hotel stays, at grandma's house, and even during summer camp. Nowhere was a safe haven from who, by this time, I had dubbed the Runner. A childish name, but somehow most fitting. It only ever struck when everyone else was asleep or away. Not once had anyone else ever heard their thunderous charge. I felt truly and utterly alone. Those who used to believe and sympathize with me had either started doubting me or were growing tired of my antics. Even my parents and numerous counselors had distanced themselves from this whole thing. It was during one of these occasions, while I was away at a cousin's house for a few nights, that I finally caught a glimpse of this thing that tormented me for over a decade at the time. I was around 16 then, staying in a small guest room that had a door fitted with a large, frosted glass window taking up most of the center, so that one could see the blurry outline of anyone standing on the other side. Odd choice for a bedroom door, I thought, but I didn't pick it out. That night, I heard those all too familiar footsteps rush towards the door, originating from somewhere deep within the house. As a side note, I've never actually heard it enter any building where I was staying. It seemed to just manifest. By this point in my life, though I was still very much afraid, I was hardly surprised when it showed up on the regular. This time around, however, I was super anxious because I knew that I might actually get the chance to see what the runner really looked like without having to risk opening my door. I wish I had not. After working myself up for a minute or so, I dared to take a peek at the glass from the safety of my blankets. I can say with confidence that my heart stopped for a few seconds. It was just barely illuminated by the light, revealing the blurred outline of the thing that had been tormenting me for so long. For some reason, I was surprised that the runner was no man. It was unnaturally tall and skinny, its arms disproportionately short and stubby for its disgustingly lanky frame. It was so tall that it had to bend over just to peer through the glass into the darkness of my room. But its face, that was the worst part. Oh God, its face. It had pressed it up against the glass to peer inside, and what I saw horrified me to no end. It's super hard to describe what exactly it looked like, especially since the glass kept everything blurry. But its head was so long, it drooped down to its feet, taking up nearly the whole length of the window, while also being alarmingly gaunt, just like the rest of its body. It was as if its face was stretched out like a giant wad of chewed up gum, stretched near to the breaking point. The runner's mouth was open, and it was a tiny gaping hole in the very bottom of its face, which I could only make out because it kept opening and closing it over and over again, much like a dying fish left out of the water. I couldn't make out the thing's eyes through the frosted glass, but by how adamant it was to try to find me in the darkness, I was curled up within. I'm sure they existed somewhere on that messed up face. What I had originally thought was perhaps some creep or homeless guy that had taken a liking to me turned out to be far from human. And it only pulled away and left after I had, understandably, screamed at the top of my lungs. Besides that horrid thing itself, I remember noticing something odd. Before my lungs had resumed working to allow me to scream, it kept wrenching its head back and forth to look towards the hall behind it. It kept doing this on repeat for that long minute or so that it stared into my room. It was as if it was checking to see if anyone was coming. Of course, my cousins and aunt, who already knew of this strange story growing up, thought I was just cooking up another chapter to my wild tale. But she still graciously allowed me to switch rooms for the rest of my stay. I can't say that putting a face to my problem helped me at all. And even now, I feel as if I were 5 years old again, unable to sleep and often resorting to medicine so I'm able to calm down enough to catch a few Z's. Knowing the horrendous sight that those footsteps belonged to had me nearly shitting myself every time it made that same dash towards my room. I feel like I haven't gotten used to it at all, despite having grown up hearing its footsteps rapidly encroaching on my room in the dark of the night, again and again. I have no idea what the runner's motive behind all of this is, nor if it even had one in the first place. I have no idea what it is. Its routine has hardly changed at all over the years. Yet, it's impossible not to be terrified by the idea that one day, this thing might just get tired of waiting at my door and end up bursting into my room. And then what? What if I go to bed one night and forget to shut my door all the way? Or I end up staying with someone who accidentally leaves it open? What if I wake one night to see its elongated face dangling over me? I just want it to stop. I don't know what it wants, and I'm certainly not keen on greeting it, because nothing that looks like that could want the best for me. It doesn't speak, and it doesn't have a schedule. It just runs. I can only assume it's doing all this to taunt me in some sick way, shape or form, and I haven't the slightest idea as to why it chose me. I'm writing all this out now because it happened again last night. It's been the first time the runner has shown up in the 2 years since I moved to this apartment. This has been the longest time that it's gone without making an appearance, since it began its antics when I was just a child. I was beginning to believe that perhaps I was finally safe. Despite living alone on the second floor, the apartment has an exterior staircase that leads up to my room, with the floors above me. And since it's been getting colder here, there was a light snowfall from last night up until this morning. It was just another Wednesday, and I was up late, studying for my upcoming test, when I heard that heavy thumping of feet slightly muffled due to the snow caking the concrete, rushing up the stairs and towards my door. At first, I had thought that it was simply one of my neighbours returning home. But the sheer speed of its ascent and the fact that it stopped at my floor was all I needed to realise just what was lurking on the other side. My heart began to race, but it skipped a few beats after what I heard next. There was silence for a minute or two, but then I heard the sound of glass shattering against the concrete just outside my door. And I swear, at that moment, I jumped so high that my head practically touched the ceiling. Needless to say, of course, I stayed up for the rest of the night, frozen in place at my desk, too deep in my utter terror to even think about making a movement. Of course, I didn't manage to get 1 ounce of sleep or any more studying in. I couldn't do a thing while not knowing if it was still out there, waiting in silence. I only found the courage to investigate when the light of the morning came and cars began pulling out of the small lot. Almost immediately, I found the source of the violent sound of breaking glass from last night. The small light attached to the wall outside my room had been smashed and broken, now resting on the snow below. Surprisingly, this wasn't even the strangest thing that was left behind. There were footprints in the snow. These prints were, unsurprisingly, not belonging to any boot I've ever known. They were very long, taking up the entire length of each step, occasionally skipping whole stairs at a time. They lacked any sort of toe marking, grooves, or heel. They just appeared to be perfectly smooth lines cut into the snow and stopping just in front of my doorway. I shuddered, hardly forgetting the appearance of this abomination that they belonged to. Looking further down the stairs, I noticed another set of prints that were equally as inhuman, yet vastly different from the other. They stopped just around the middle portion of the staircase, for whatever reason, not continuing up any further than this. They were also quite large, yet perfectly round, almost reminding me of what an elephant's foot might leave behind if one were to ever step foot in the snow. Set within the middle of each of these circles was a large spiral drawn out into the snow. I have more questions than answers after last night. What does the runner want from me? Was there something else out there last night? Is this ever going to stop?